You'll let me know if it's working. That's my stream. I've started recording. You'll let me know if it's working for you.
It's working for me too.
Perfect. Merci. Donc,
all right, thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is Marie-Josée Simon from CEPOQ, if you don't know me, and welcome to all of the attendees tonight for this fall webinar for the sector. We're going to talk about factors affecting fertility in sheep, especially in ewes. And we have a guest from New Zealand, Mr. Dr. Paul Kenyon, and I'm going to give him the floor just after this short introduction. So and now it's evening here, time for a glass of wine, but in New Zealand, we're already Friday and it's lunchtime, so maybe a little bit too early for a glass of wine for our friend Paul. Now, just before we get started, I just want to let you know that this webinar is funded through the funding support of the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. It's an agreement between the Government of Canada and Quebec for the Innovation Agri-Food Program. And I also have a little bit of housekeeping. You have an option at the bottom of your screen to select the French channel if you want to hear interpretation into French by our interpreter, Pamela Cousineau, who's with us tonight. Or if you want to hear the English, you can select English as well to hear Paul directly. And my colleague, Jacques Pinel, is also here with us. Jade, hello. She's here with us, and she's on the English channel, actually. So she will be taking questions for those on the English side, and I'll raise the questions for those speaking French. So you can ask questions using the Q&A icon is at the bottom of your screen. Or if you prefer, you can choose to raise your hand and ask your question yourself. All you need to do is use that raise hand function. So after the webinar, we are going to share the link on chat so that you can answer our brief survey to see if you enjoyed the webinar. And you also are going to have the option of selecting either the French version or the English version for the little survey. So now I'm going to give you the floor right away. Paul, thank you for being here with us tonight. And now you can maybe introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll get into the presentation. Here we go. Thank you. I think you should be able to share your screen.
Good evening, all. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to talk to you. And I just want to say from the start, if anything isn't clear due to my English or due to myself using terminology from our New Zealand sheep industry that's not clear, please feel free to ask questions as we go. The talk is in about 5 sections, and after each section, we'll pause for a bit, and we'll have the opportunity, if you wish, to ask questions either around clarity or if you want some more information. So my area of expertise, as the first slide said, is sheep production. I grew up on a sheep farm in New Zealand within the sheep and beef group within our school, and I currently head the School of Agriculture and Environment at Massey University. So the 5 sections I've chosen to talk about today are firstly, a brief introduction about sheep farming in New Zealand and the changes that have occurred over the last 30 years, just to give some context to our system, and also to help with clarification when I talk about some of the other sections later on. And then the four sections I'm going to focus on are breeding ewe lambs at about 8 months of age in terms of management options to maximise performance. And I'm not going to cover every point, but I'm going to focus on the major drivers of success. Then I'm going to talk about maximising fertility or reproductive performance in mature ewes, with a focus on body condition scoring and nutrition, because if you want to be successful, you have to address nutrition and make sure the ewe's in good condition to start with. You know, you can have different breeds, but those breeds won't perform to their potential unless they're well fed and in good condition. I'm then going to touch on ewe wastage or ewe losses and how that impacts on flock performance and profitability, and what some drivers of that and what you can do about that in terms of reducing ewe wastage. And then touch on breeding out of season and some Sorry, it went quiet there for a bit on my screen. It said I was muted, so hopefully I'm not muted now. And then we'll talk about breeding out of season and what farmers can do. Yes?
Pardon? Yes, sorry, Paul. Actually, we don't see you on screen anymore, but we can still hear you clearly, but we don't see you anymore. I don't know if that's on purpose or if you're further away from your camera. We see the background. We don't see you anymore.
Okay. I'll change that. Can you see me now? I'm back. Okay.
Oui.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'll talk about breeding out of season. Our research group is quite a large sheep and beef group. Our current research projects are listed there, and while I'm going to touch on some of those topics today, some I won't. But at the end, if anyone has any questions about some of that research, I'd also be very happy to answer those. Okay, to start with a summary of sheep farming in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, we're a pastoral graze system, outdoors all year round, on pasture, grass mainly, but also with some legume component. And our type of pasture is not protein limited. So when our farmers talk about nutritional requirements, they're either talking about ME, metabolisable energy requirements, or kilograms of dry matter. Our herbages we grow outside are not protein limiting. Also on our farms, sheep and beef cattle are grazed together. Our system, because we don't have the very harsh winter that you have, nor do we have the very dry summers that Australia has, we don't use any grain supplementation. We do instead, though, grow some herbages, or what we call crops, for grazing in situ or in the paddock. And that might be a brassica type crop, or some legumes, or some herbs. We then also make hay and silage to move the feed when we have excess herbage growing in spring to dry bits of summer or to be fed in the winter. In our system, use only once a year lambing. And remember, we're Southern Hemisphere, so we're opposite seasons. We're breeding predominantly through mid-March through to mid-May to be lambing in that August-October period. The vast majority of our ewes are bred for the first time at about 18 months to 19 months of age, but about 30% are bred at 8 months of age in their first autumn. And that percentage is increasing as a means of increasing profitability on our farms. And I'm going to touch on that today. Natural breeding only, flock breeding in the paddocks with teams of rams at a ratio of about 1 to 100. They use lamb, as I said, once a year, and usually culled after their 6th year. So they have 5 sets of lambings, and they usually get culled for age at that stage, because we, under our outdoor pastoral systems, once they get into 7 years of age, performance starts to drop. So farmers cull before then, and of course there are losses with deaths and wastage prior to that as well. And as I said, lambing occurs August through to October. So slightly different system from yours. Just to give you a bit of an idea about how farming has changed in New Zealand over the last 30 years, our farms in New Zealand, we have about 12,000 sheep farms, are categorised into 8 classes. SI means South Island, NI means North Island, because we have 2 main islands. And then they're categorised based really on the topography, hill country down to flatter country, which tends to be called intensive or finishing country. And this table just shows over time what the percentage of income comes from the farm from either the sale of wool, sheep, in terms of animals that go to slaughter. And what you see is, if we compare that 1989 to 1990 situation through to the 2019-2020 situation, wool is now only a minor component of our income. More increasingly, it's the farmer income is driven by sheep sales, either animals direct to slaughter or animals sold post-weaning to another farm to finish, such as some of those finishing farms there, the South Island finishing farm or the North Island intensive finishing farm. There's been a real change. So reproduction is now the focus and not wool. Of course, you'll notice those numbers don't add up to 100 within those calendar or those years. That's because, remember, I said to you at the start, our farming systems are mixed with beef cattle. So the difference is that adds up to 100 is the income that comes either from cattle, or in some of those intensive finishing or mixed farms, the farmers might be growing grain like canola, etc. as well. So the sheep and the beef are only a smaller part of those farms. So that's basically what's occurred in terms of our farming systems over time. We've moved from wool, and if I'd have gone back to the 1970s, wool was even a higher component, and we're now about selling meat. And this is our industry data in terms of what's happened to our population of animals. 3 lines here, and if we look at the y-axis or the vertical axis, sheep are on one side, these in hundreds of thousands. Millions, sorry. Hundreds of thousands, sorry. Hundreds of thousands. So we've got currently, if you look at the green line, we've got just under 30 million. We've got 27 million sheep. But if you see back to 1990, we were close to 60 million sheep. And if you went back to 1980, we had 70 million sheep. So our sheep numbers have halved by more than half in the last 30 years, and they're 60+% down from 1980. Beef cattle numbers have also declined during that period, but you see that dairy cattle, and so the dairy there is in relation to cattle, numbers increased. And what's occurred is, on the flatter, more fertile, easier country, a lot of the land that was traditionally sheep and beef farming has gone to either dairy cattle farming or to cropping solely without livestock, or it's gone into horticulture, such as kiwi fruit, apples, etc. Or it's gone into viticulture, wine production. And of course, as with all countries, the human population has grown too. So the urban sprawl has got bigger as well. But our sheep population, if we just focus on today's talk, is a lot less than it was 30 years ago. But that's actually not necessarily a negative story. Because if you look at the top graph now I have, and you use that same green line, that's the number of sheep again. That's the head in millions of sheep, and you know, going down to that 27 million. But the black line is the tons of meat, sheep meat that we sell. So even though our sheep population has dropped by more than 50%, the total amount of sheep meat we sell is only dropped by 15%. And that's been driven by increased fertility and fecundity in the ewes that we now have. So they're producing far more lambs per ewe than they did in the past. And those lambs are heavier at weaning and at slaughter, which is the bottom table there on that slide. So if you look at the 1990 data versus the 2019-2020 data, you'll see that lambing percentage has gone up. And in fact, the 2021 lambing percentage was 135%. Because we're outdoors, it does move 2 or 3% every year just by environmental effects. The weight of lamb weaned per ewe, that's carcass, has gone up 37%. And because we've gone up in the number of lambs weaned per ewe and the carcass weight of lambs weaned per ewe, total production has more than doubled on a per ewe basis in terms of weight of carcass that she weans. And I indicated before that wool is not a driver anymore, because actually the value of the wool, the vast majority of the wool that we sell, which is over 30 microns, hasn't changed in price. So actually real value has declined in the last 30 years. So our wool production hasn't changed because farmers are putting no emphasis into that. The fine wool industry, the merino industry, which still has a high value wool, only makes up 4% of our national flock. So that's why wool, when you look at the aggregate industry figures, doesn't really show, even though we are well known for fine wool. It is a small part of our industry now. You can also see that at the bottom two rows on that table, that milk production in terms of milk solids per cow, just to give an idea that also the dairy industry has increased in that time. But the beef industry has pretty much stayed pretty stable with only a 5% change in terms of carcass weight. Our industry collects a lot of data each year. We have a national body called Beef and Lamb New Zealand, who collects a levy for every animal that's slaughtered and a small levy for every kilo of wool that's sold. And they use that money for collecting industry data, for tech transfer and education of farmers, and to fund research and also education. And because they collect a lot of industry data, we're lucky that we can get that. So I just thought I'd grab these two images from 2011 and 2020. They survey about 7% of our 12,000 farmers. So you can get percentage of performance, and you can see the top graph is the lambing percentage and the distribution on farms in 2011 versus 2020. So the below graph, you'll see that we're getting a shift to my right. I presume it's your right on the slide for you too, in the direction of the arrow, where lambing percentage is continuing to increase, and we're certainly getting less and less of those farms below 100% lambing. Now, those farms that are below 100% lambing are pretty much all merino farms. Merinos in New Zealand are farmed on our harshest, steepest, driest part of the country, because remember, the merino originally came from North Africa, so it's suited in terms of the dry under its feet. It's suited for that conditions, and because we don't grow a lot of herbage, also they do well on that, and it means it helps maintain fineness of their wool. So that's that end of the industry, and it won't change much because their focus is producing fine wool. But the rest of the industry, as I said, is focusing on increasing the mature lambing percentage, number of lambs born, per ewe lamb, and more ewe lambs being bred at 8 months of age, lamb growth to weaning, increasing carcass weights. And putting all that together, the real focus of the industry is increasing the kilo of lamb weaned, whether that's live weight or carcass per ewe. And we're moving in what we would say the right direction through technology transfer of research has been taken and still being undertaken. So, is there any questions on the New Zealand industry before I move on to the next part of the presentation?
Hi, Paul. We do have a question about average number of lambs for breeding.
Yeah, so that lambing percentage, sorry, that's a good question because it means I was not very clear. That lambing percentage of 135% on that top graph means the average ewe is weaning 1.35 lambs per year. So when we talk about lambing percentage, that's kind of times 100, the number of lambs weaned per ewe. And remembering our ewes lamb once a year, outdoors, in late winter, early spring.
Parfait. J'aurais une question du côté français. C'est quoi les principales races?
There's a question in French. What are the main breeds that you have? You talked about merinos, but there must be other breeds for meat production.
That's a good question. So we recently did an industry survey of 4,000 farmers, and we got over 100 different breeds and composites. But the vast majority of them are very minor. So the biggest breed in terms of percentage of flock is the Romney and the New Zealand Romney. That is followed by two other New Zealand breeds, the Perindale and the Coopworth. Now, those three breeds are dual purpose. Coarse wool above 30 microns. The Romney in our situation is probably 34 to 38 microns. The Coopworth 35 to 40 microns, and the Perindale 29 to 35 microns. But they've really, in the recent years, those three breeds, which make up probably 80% of our national flock, have focused on reproductive performance. So if you're on lowland country, flat country, you're probably either going to have Romneys or Coopworths, because the Coopworth was developed for increased fertility and milk production over the traditional Romney. So it is actually a composite made from the Romney 40 years ago. And the Perindale is the same. It was a breed that was made from a composite crossing the Romney with other breeds for a harder hill country animal. So if you're in the harder hill country, it's steeper, less grass production, an animal you need to be a bit hardier, you'd probably have a Perindale. So the Romney, as I said, is around that 50%, or composites off the Romney, and the Coopworth's around about 8 to 9%, and the Perindale's around 6 to 8%. So that's kind of where the main breeds are. And then what our farmers do often is for meat production, and those breeds have been selecting also for meat traits within the breed. Our farmers also use what we call terminal sires. So a breed of ram is used that is a meat breed, such as a Suffolk, a Poll Dorset, or a Texel. They're the three main meat breeds in New Zealand. And maybe somewhere between 20 and 50% of ewes on farms are bred to those. They generally the ewes that farmers do not want to get replacement ewe lambs out of, or they might be older ewes. Okay, to speed up the genetic gain, they're trying to get replacements out of young ewes. So the younger ewes and the ewes that are the farmer deems are as better ewes are bred. So if they're a Romney ewe, bred to a Romney ram, and then the remaining of the ewes, somewhere on farms between 20 and 50%, and each farm differs, they will put those ewes to a terminal meat breed, giving a composite lamb. All of those lambs, whether they're male or female, are then destined for slaughter. So hopefully that's answered that question in regards to breeds.
Ben, je croirais, c'est très précis, merci.
Yes, I think so. That was very specific. Thank you, Paul. There's another question, the last one maybe, so that we can move to the next portion. So at what age do you wean the lambs? That's a question for you.
Yep, that's a good question. So weaning generally occurs on most farms 100 to 110 days after the start of lambing. And on most of our farms, they only breed for 2 cycles of 34 days. So that means the oldest lamb's 110 days of age, and the youngest lamb is around 80 days of age. So we often say, and remembering that most ewes, because we only breed once a year in autumn, 70% to 80% will conceive in that first 17 days of breeding. So the average age is around 95 to 100 days of age. And in New Zealand, under pastoral grazing, the average weaning weight is somewhere between 29 and 31 kilos.
Parfait, merci.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'll go on to the next presentation. That's about breeding ewe lambs at 8 months of age. In New Zealand, a New Zealand term for an animal that age is a hogget. So hopefully I'll remember not to say hogget, and I'll remember to keep saying ewe lambs. We, through the research that our group has done here at Massey, we, in partnership with Beef and Lamb New Zealand, which is that industry body I talked about, have developed a book, a farmer booklet, in terms of maximising ewe lamb or hogget performance, and kind of management guidelines. And so that book can actually be downloaded from anywhere in the world as a PDF, which is that bottom address. Also, there's a podcast which goes for about an hour, also about that topic that they asked me to do. So, which will have far more detail on ewe lamb breeding, both of those, than what we'll cover today. If anyone has any interest, they're freely available. Right, so our farmers want to breed ewe lambs, because there's many advantages, and these advantages are regardless of production system, and they'll be the same anywhere in the world. It's about getting a return out of them in their first year in terms of meat sales, so a lamb out of them, and it's a way of getting more lambs born on your farm in a year. In our situation, New Zealand, where we tend to grow excess herbage in spring when we're lambing, it's a way of getting more feed demand on the farm. So you've got an extra group of lactating ewes and young lambs consuming pasture. If you can be successful in that and getting them to breed and wean lamb in that first year of life, if they're going to be culled, as I said, at a set age, you'll get more if you do it correctly. Increased lifetime performance. Some farmers use it as an early selection screening tool, because we know that an animal that's more fertile and fecund at 8 months of age will genetically be more fertile and fecund at 18 months of age. So some farmers actually breed or put to the ram more ewe lambs than they need as replacements, but then only keep those that get pregnant as a selection tool. Of course, some farmers also select progeny born to ewe lambs as a way of having more to select from as a replacement, so you get more genetic pressure. And it's a way of reducing the generation interval and speeding up genetic gain if you select ewe lambs born to ewe lambs as replacements. And if all that works well, you should make more money. Now, we've undertaken a lot of research over the last 15 years. We were the home for the national program on ewe lamb breeding. And I'm not going to cover every point, but I'm just going to cover the main points, because if you don't get these right, some of the finer detail doesn't matter. And the first one is that, remember, she's a young ewe, somewhat akin to a teenage, in human terminology, teenage girl. And so she's going through puberty, and so she will have irregular estrus, shorter estrus, less intense estrus, lower ova or egg survival, lower embryo survival, so greater embryonic mortality and greater risk of fetal mortality, and of course, lamb death. So we looked at across about 15,000 ewes, lambs on many farms. We bred them. We allowed the farmers to breed them at the weight they would naturally breed them at as part of their normal practice. And then we went back 3 years later and we weighed and re-weighed those young ewes that had been bred as ewe lambs when they were 3-year-olds. So somewhat, we would say, at their mature weight. And then we looked at the fertility as a ewe lamb against their mature weight, or what percentage of their mature weight there was. And based on what this graph pretty much shows you is that regardless of breed, because there are many breeds in here as well, across those 14,000 ewe lambs across many farms, you really want, if you're going to be breeding ewe lambs successfully at 8 or so months of age, they need to be 65 to 70% of their mature weight. And talking about percentage of mature weight is a better thing to think about than me tell you what weight they should be, because the sheep in New Zealand are different than the sheep in Canada, but the sheep on one farm in New Zealand are different than the neighbour's farm. They're different breeds, they're different sizes. So a weight is actually an irrelevant terminology in many respects. It's around percentage of mature weight. And that holds in all mammals, actually. In all mammals, it's always somewhere between 60 to 70% of mature weight that reproductive success is highest in a young female around puberty. So it holds in sheep. So if you knew the mature weight of your ewes, or what they are at about 3 years of age going into breeding, you could then calculate what that minimum weight should be on your farm to get that high reproductive performance. Another way of looking at it is their body condition score. Body condition is a subjective measure, and I'll touch on this again later on with our mature ewes. It's a subjective measure of levels of body fat. And I'm not sure if body condition scoring is used in New Zealand, but in Canada. But in New Zealand, it's used a lot by our farmers. It's by putting your hand across the lumbar region and about where the 12th rib is, and rubbing your hand down the side of the rib and across the vertical processes or across the top of the spine, and feeling how much soft tissue you can feel. The more soft tissue or the less bone you feel, the higher the condition score. And it's on a scale of 1 to 5. And so the more body reserve or fat the female has, the higher the body condition score. And that's important in all mammals, because one of the triggers that allows a female, what tells her reproductive system she's now mature enough to start breeding, is one of the triggers of the hypothalamic pituitary axis is that the female has enough body reserves to cope with the rigors of pregnancy and lactation. So another way of determining if your young ewe lambs are ready to go to the ram and to get high success is actually to body condition score them. And we say to the farmers, unless she's at 2.5 or greater, don't bother, because she's still in that growth phase and she isn't going to be physiologically mature. So you could use percentage of mature weight as a tool, because once you get above that 65% of mature weight, your body is switching to the stage where it's putting on fat rather than lean or muscle as a female sheep. Or you could use a condition score minimum. And that's the biggest driver of success in ewe lambs, is having them heavy enough and a good enough condition at breeding in terms of the number of lambs and the weight of lambs you'll ever wean off those ewe lambs in that first year. That's why I spend a lot of time focusing on that, and we spend a lot of field days around the country, or farmer days around the country, going over that. And we say to farmers, what you should do is you should know what the weaning weights of your lambs are, because those ewe lambs are then going to be those ones you're going to then breed 5 or 6 months later. You should have worked out what your mature weight of your ewe flock is, so then you have a weaning weight, and then you can calculate that 65% mature weight target. And then you can just say, okay, that's the live weight change I need to do over the next 5 months. This is how much they need to grow at or gain at for every day during that period. And just monitor a few. Draw a little hand graph of where they are now and where they need to be. And then every month, just weigh a subset and see how they go. And then you'll know early if they're going to meet those targets or not. It's too late a month before breeding trying to quickly get them there. especially in our scenario where we aren't using any concentrate or grain supplements to allow them to quickly gain weight. And of course, I'm not going to touch on any detail today, but I can talk about this if you're watching questions. There's vaccinations against the abortive diseases, ensuring they don't have any health issues such as parasites that are impeding their growth, and as well as that mineral status as well. Because she's a young female going into puberty, from a reproductive perspective, she's quite naive, and her reproductive performance is varied and can be low. So a tool that farmers can use to ensure that ewe lambs are cycling at the appropriate time is to use what we would call a teaser or vasectomized ram, and a short exposure to them just before the plans start breeding. And that can induce puberty. So exposure of ewe lambs to a teaser for 17 days directly before plans started breeding, for when you introduce an entire ram or an intact ram, can work. And it can increase the numbers pregnant and those pregnant early in the breeding period, because what it does is those that haven't quite tipped into puberty, it makes puberty occur slightly earlier, and so then they're cycling the day the ram goes in. And in our situation in New Zealand, if people are breeding new lambs, they do it for a short window of, again, for about 34 days, 2 reproductive cycles, because they don't want a protracted or extended lambing period, because that makes problems then getting them rebred at 18 months of age to match the rest of the mature ewe flock. And for us, in our situation, teasers or vasectomized rams can be effective in terms of successful at inducing puberty at ratios of 1 teaser to 75 ewe lambs. You don't need a lot of them. It's their pheromones, their smell that does it, not their behavior, it's their smell. And in fact, we've done some work, and others have in Australia too, that within 12 hours of a vasectomized ram being next to a ewe lamb just before she naturally is going to achieve puberty, within 12 hours you can get changes in her hormonal profile. We've measured changes in hormonal profile that quick. So it's a stench that does it. But I would say, and we say this to farmers all the time, and some farmers ignore us, but they then have problems, do not use a teaser to get very light ewe lambs cycling. It'll work. You can use a teaser in ewe lambs that are only 50% of their mature weight and can induce them to reach puberty. And yes, you can get them pregnant. But as I'll explain in the next few slides, you're just setting them up to fail, because very light ewe lambs are less likely to successfully wean a lamb. Their lambs, because they're either going to not conceive, they've got greater chance of fetal loss, they've got greater chance of lamb loss around and post-lambing. Those lambs will be lighter on average. And she, as a young female that's still going through the growth phase of her life, will be stunted. And therefore, later performance or lifetime performance will be disappointing. So don't use a teaser to fix a live weight problem in your ewe lambs. Choice of rams, very important. And we spend a lot of time focusing on our farmers about this, because remember, again, thinking about it, she's a young female, equivalent to a teenager, still growing. So her bones are still growing. So her pelvic opening will be relatively small. And so if you breed her with a ram who's of a genotype for a large birth weight, that fetus has been given the genes to grow. That fetus has been given the genes to draw off mum. And as with all animals and all mammals, the mother, in this case ewe lamb, will always feed that growing fetus to the best of her capability, even at her own expense. We've all seen animals go down with pregnancy toxemia, pregnant females, because they're trying to save the fetus at their own expense. And so what happens if you choose the wrong ram, you'll end up with a large fetus, lamb that's been born, but you've got a small pelvic opening. And so young ewes are very susceptible to stochia or difficult birth. So you need to be thinking about your ram choice And what we say to farmers, ideally, this is a bonus lamb for most farmers. They're not, in New Zealand, most of them are not selecting replacements born to ewe lambs. They use it as a bonus lamb that then goes on to slaughter. So use a ram of a smaller frame size or genotype. Or at worst case, use the same breed ram as that young ewe. Do not use a terminal sire or a meat breed, because they have been selected for many, many years to grow. And therefore, they will result in big lambs. And I'll tell you through a number of experiments that we've done here in New Zealand and colleagues in Australia and in the UK have done, is that genetics, or the genes that that fetus has to grow, has more impact on its birth size than feeding. A lot of farmers say, oh, I don't want to overfeed my young ewe, because if I do that, the fetus will grow too big. That's not the case. We've done numbers of studies, as the other groups have, to show that you can end up with a young ewe lamb at lambing that can differ by 20 to 30 kilos. In our situation, they started off being bred at 40 kilos, so they're lambing at either 60, 70 or 80 kilos. So the 80 kilo ones have grown a lot during pregnancy and been fed really well. If they start off at 40 kilos the day the ram went in, 45 kilos, sorry, when the day the ram went in. But the birth weight of those lambs, when we've used the same size, has only differed by 200 to 300 grams. But the ewes differ by 20 kilos. And I can tell you that heavier ewe, is 20 kilos heavier, she can easily expel that fetus that's 200 grams heavier than that lighter ewe who's a lot smaller, who's got a fetus that's only 200 grams lighter. So don't get hung up in feeding and birth weight. If you're worrying about birth size, it's all about the sire. And so therefore, can you get information on that as a benefit? When it comes to breeding, remember, we're different than you, I understand, because you're mostly indoors, but ours are outdoor breeding. And so we've got a ratio of about 1 ram to 50 to 75 ewe lambs, but we're breeding in teams. So, there might be a mob of 400 or 500 ewe lambs. So there might be 8 rams in with that mob. Okay, that we're not single sire mating. They're not 1 ram with 50 ewes, and then another paddock, 1 ram with 50 ewes. In New Zealand, we team mate. So there'd be, in this case, if you had 400 ewe lambs and you using 1 to 50, you'd put out 8 rams altogether. And that's important because on any given day, there'll be different ewes on estrus or on heat. And you want, because she's on heat for a shorter period of time, she's less receptive to the male, and she's less likely to stand for the male in comparison to mature ewe. You want to maximize the chance that she comes into contact with a mature ram. And therefore, we say to our farmers, avoid using ewe lambs with ram lambs, because also the ram lamb has lower seminal reserves and lower drive as well. Now, if you're breeding indoors in pens, these type of ratios are probably not relevant, but they are for us. The big issue with ewe lamb breeding is that she, as I said, in human terms, a teenage mother. So she's still growing through her pregnancy. Whereas a mature ewe, when you get her pregnant, she is not growing. She's already reached a mature weight. And that the changes you see in terms of nutritional demand in pregnancy are all about the growth of that pregnancy or conceptus. And this graph here just shows you over the 150 days of pregnancy, but I know that pregnancy is 147 days, just the way I draw a graph. You can see the weight change on average for the udder development, the placenta, and the fetus for a ewe carrying 1 lamb. And as we know in our mature ewes, there's increased nutritional demand in the last third of gestation, and we often have our feeding guidelines set up that in the last third of gestation, you're feeding the ewe more and more to meet that demand. You can't do that with a ewe lamb because she needs to be growing throughout pregnancy. She needs to be getting that structurally bigger, remember, because she's a teenager. So she actually needs to be gaining weight throughout pregnancy. And of course, she can't physically grow herself in terms of her stature and her body reserves in the last third of pregnancy, because the fetal demand takes over and there's a physiological switch and all the energy and nutrients gets prioritized towards the uterus and the placenta. So that means in a young female, you need to be feeding her well throughout pregnancy, in the first 2/3 of pregnancy, to make sure she grows. And farmers say, oh, I'm very worried if I overfeed her in the first 2/3 of pregnancy around that big birth weight issue. That won't occur because, as you see in this graph here, the fetus is relatively small up to about day 60 of pregnancy. And so that extra feeding in the first 2/3 of pregnancy is actually about her growing structurally and in frame size and body reserves. So in a ewe lamb, we need to be feeding her well throughout pregnancy. And that's quite different than how we manage our mature ewes. So we've created these type of graphs for our farmers. And in that booklet I talked about before, which we're just actually just updating this month, a new booklet will be available, the updated version after Christmas. We'll be having graphs like this in it. So we could say to our farmers, if you started with a 45 kilo animal in May, because we're breeding ewe lambs in May, remember that's that late autumn for us, this would be, the orange line would be the total weight trajectory that you would want her to be gaining throughout pregnancy. And that's 130 grams per day. And many of you would say that's a lot of weight to put on throughout pregnancy. You might agree with me, in late pregnancy that's needed because of the growing of the fetus and the development of the placenta and the fluids around the fetus. But it needs to be at that throughout pregnancy, so that first 2/3, it's about her growing. Because the day after she lambs, which is this lambing period here, remember, if she's carrying one lamb and that lamb's about 4 kilos, the fluid around that lamb inside the placenta will be another 4 to 5 kilos, and then the placenta itself can be 1 to 1.5 kilos. So she'll lose 10 kilos in total weight the day after she lambs. That's total weight. That's not her weight, but that's her total weight. So remember that orange line, when it peaked there at the highest, that was the total weight. That included her body weight and that of the pregnancy. And so she loses that. And then she starts to gain it throughout pregnancy. We get to weaning. And in this particular example here, for the average New Zealand farmer, we say that they need to be around about 58 kilos. If you're going to get her up to 65 kilos for remating at 18 months of age, which is a standard farmer guideline in New Zealand for Romneys, which, remember, I said was our, just over 50% of our flock. So, and the average Romney is around about 67 to 70 kilos at 3 years of age. So at 18 months of age, the target's about 65 kilos. So that's the growth profile, or the live weight change profile. We've done a lot of research here, and actually in Australia, they've done similar research to say that's the optimal profile. So we have feeding guidelines, pasture guidelines to achieve that. The grayer line is the optimal profile if you don't breed her at 8 months of age. So that's your traditional ewe lamb. So that's 70% of the animals we have in New Zealand. That's the profile. To get them to that same point at about that mid to late December, when weaning would be occurring. And then they'd go back together, both the non-pregnant group, which is the greyish colour, and the orange, those that lambed, reaching that target. So we've developed those guidelines for farmers, and we suggest to farmers, every 28 days to every month, they should weigh a subset to make sure the animals are meeting those targets. And if you meet those targets, you'll achieve optimal performance. And so this is probably not that relevant to you in Canada, in an indoor situation, but what we've done at the same time is done a lot of feeding studies under pasture, ryegrass, white clover, to say what's the optimum height to graze at to meet those targets. And in New Zealand, because, as I've said, we don't use those concentrate or grain supplements, often what has to occur, and I'll touch on this again later, if you breed ewe lambs, is you have to remove other classes of stock if you're going to keep the same amount of feed on your farm. We've also, again, and you can't see them all here, but there's actually, these are these 14,000 ewe lambs I talked about earlier on. These are just some of the data across 3 farms. We looked at what's the weight of the ewe lamb at 3 to 4 weeks prior to breeding, and what impact, these are all animals that were diagnosed as pregnant, and what impact does that have on the chance of her lamb dying or not surviving the lambing period through to weaning. And you can see the lighter they are, the greater the chance that their lambs will die. And this is, again, this is done under commercial situation on farms, and again, matching that, getting to those weights at lambing. You know, that 60 kilos there, which is the middle of that green dot, this is 3 to 4 weeks before lambing. So they would be, if they're gaining another 130 grams per day, around that 65-ish kilos just before lambing. So that all matches under commercial conditions too. And then under New Zealand situation, we've also got optimal grazing conditions for during the lambing period and in lactation if we want to maximise performance. And in lactation, and we covered this point before, we said we want to be weaning at about 80 to 100 days. Some farms wean slightly earlier because, I didn't say this earlier, but our ewe lambs are bred a month after the mature ewe flock. But then the next year, when they're bred for the second time, they're bred at the same time. So they've got a month less before rebreeding. So some farmers are more likely to wean at 80 rather than 100 days to give that young lamb an extra 20 days to gain weight. And we know that if she doesn't hit those 18-month targets, which I showed you on that graph, she's more likely to not be in the flock in a few years' time. So she's less likely to survive because of ewe wastage. She'll have a greater chance of showing poor reproductive performance, and therefore her lifetime performance won't be increased. So we're confident in those targets now for the New Zealand situation. And we've also done some modelling, and I won't spend much time on this at all, but our farmers, because as I said, we have a set amount of feed on our farms, have asked questions like, am I better to breed my mature ewes and focus on them and increase their reproductive performance, or work on increasing the ewe lamb reproductive performance? And so we've done some bioeconomic modelling for our farmers based on a constrained feed. In other words, this is how much feed you have on the farm. You have no ability to bring feed in. And the grey dots show that to be just as profitable as an average flock producing 135% or 1.35 lambs per mature ewe, you have to, in your ewe lambs, achieve 26% or 0.26 lambs, which is not very many. But of course, remember, when you breed ewe lambs, you've got extra feed demand because now they're pregnant, lactation, extra demand, and you've got to get them heavier for breeding at 8 months of age. So you have to drop your mature ewe numbers down. So the total number of lambs you wean from your mature ewes is less. So that's the break-even point. And so there's some other break-even points there, but I won't talk about that anymore, except for we know now for different scenarios, we can say to our farmers, what should they focus on? To make more money on their farms, should they focus on increasing the reproductive performance of their mature ewes, or hold their mature ewes where they are and focus on improving reproductive performance of ewe lambs? But for many of our farmers, it's easier to make more money by increasing the reproductive performance of their mature ewes than it is to increase the reproductive performance of ewe lambs, because ewe lambs have all that extra difficulty in terms of meeting those live weight targets and having to feed them so much more during the winter when our pasture growth is poor. We've then done a lot of long-term studies looking at the long-term impacts, and we know that as long as the ewe lamb gets to that 65 kilos at 18 months of age, then there are no negative lifetime impacts. But if she's any more than 3 kilos below that, or half a condition score, then you'll get negative lifetime impacts in terms of she's less likely to be maintained in the flock, less likely to survive, and have lower reproductive performance, which I touched on before. And on average, for our farmers, when they do it correctly, they are weaning an extra 0.8 to 1.6 lambs per ewe lifetime. And that's why they breed ewe lambs. However, if they don't do it correctly and they don't meet those targets, a number of farms and the modelling we've done and the data we've recorded on those farms, they're actually worse off because their lambing performance, the ewe lambs, is poor, and they've actually had to reduce the numbers of ewe lambs on their farms because of the constrained feed supply to do that. And so the actual number of lambs they produce in terms of kilo of lambs weaned per year or meat sold is actually less. So it's about meeting those targets if you want to be successful with ewe lambs. Is there any questions on that?
On a plusieurs questions pour toi.
We have
Paul.
several questions for you, Paul. So I'll go with the ones on this side. The first one I have is someone asking is if the body weight fat has the same impact on adult as on young youth.
Yep, we'll talk about that in actually the very next slide. Good question.
Parfait, donc je te laisse y répondre. Oui, on va
All right,
passer.
then I'll let you answer that when you get there. And I'll let Jade ask. Oh, no, I had one more question in French as well.
Okay.
Asking, do you do the same with your ewes fully? I think that they talk about the feeding because the question is not specific. It was a question asked a little while ago, but you were talking about feeding at the time, or otherwise maybe the questioner could ask that question more specifically. I'm not exactly sure.
I will talk about feeding guidelines of our mature ewes in the next few slides. So maybe I'll address it there, and if not, after that section, we can ask that question again.
D'accord, parfait. Donc,
all right, sounds good. In that case, Jade has a few questions as well.
Yes, I do have three very interesting questions. I'll start with the one that's more related to fertility. We've been asked here in Quebec, we're used to being told that 14 to 15 days with the teaser is enough. There was a wonder of if you have anything to say about the 17 that you mentioned before.
So I'll actually show a graph on that later on when we talk about breeding out of season. You can actually get the response in 2 to 3 days. The reason we use 17 days is because that's the natural reproductive cycle of a ewe. So in the graph, when I show it towards the end of my presentation, it'll be quite clear. Yeah. So on some of our farms where they do not want to maintain vasectomized rams all year because they're a cost of feeding them and they're only used for a short window, what our farmers do is you can use an entire ram for 2 to 3 days, and his pheromones and stench will be enough to get the response. But they won't actually start cycling until 17 days after that. So you'll see in the graph, the cycling can be shorter, but the response you see is 17 days later.
Perfect, thank you. I do have two other questions. One is, what species of forage are you using for pastures?
So we use ryegrass, white clover is our main grass. We also, so that's our main grass. White clover is our main legume, followed by red clover. Some parts of the country can grow lucerne or alfalfa. Chicory and plantain are grown as well, often in mixes with the ryegrass, increasingly in mixes with the ryegrass to give a diverse pasture mix so the animals can choose. And then in terms of the crops we plant for grazing, they're often brassica crops, turnips, Swedes, a grazing rape we have here are the main ones. Oh, and sometimes we have some green feed wheat as well. That's not for seed; it's grown for feed. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks. It was very a complete answer. Last question is asked by a veterinarian asking which vaccines you normally use.
So our two biggest abortive issues in New Zealand are toxoplasmosis and Campylobacter. So the two vaccines that we have available in New Zealand are against those abortive diseases, and about 90% of animals are vaccinated for those. They're quite cheap in New Zealand because of the volume, and they're easy to get. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, well, I'll move on to mature ewes, and this is the answer. Pretty much every production trait in mature ewes, and also the fertility traits in rams, follow this curve. It's a curvilinear response, whereas as the animal goes from being in poor condition, 1.5, towards more of an average condition, 2.5, whatever the reproductive measure is, ovulation rate, conception rate, embryonic survival, milk production, you name it, wool production, it follows this. So the optimal performance occurs in that 3 to 3.5 condition score window. Above 3.5, you don't get any increase in performance, but they're fatter. They've got more body reserve, more adipose tissue. So they're actually inefficient because it's cost you a lot of food to put on fat, because it takes more food to put on a kilo of fat than it does per kilo of lean or muscle or meat. So therefore, the biggest jump in performance you get is when you use at a very poor condition and you move her half a condition score. So from 1.5 to 2, you'll get a big jump in reproductive performance or milk performance. And as you go higher and higher up the condition score, the smaller the jump, until you get to about 3.5 and it plateaus. So we say to our farmers, the ideal situation, I'm going to show a couple of graphs on this, is to have all your ewes in that 3 to 3.5 window. You don't want them above 3.5 because you've spent too much money on food and you won't get the economic return. And below 3, the further you are away from 3 or the poorer the condition, the lower the performance. And we say to our farmers, in our situations, there's 4 times a year that you should condition score animals, feel the condition of the animals, so feel how bony they are, and make management decisions then based on feeding, because a condition score in our breeds, to change a condition score, so to go from a 2 to a 3, is somewhere between 6 and 8 kilos of live weight, depending on the breed and frame size. So it's going to take a while to do that. So we say at weaning, condition score the ewes, the very poor ones, target feeding them. We use the word target feeding. Put extra feed into them, so you get their condition score up, so they have high reproductive performance at breeding. If you've done that and they're all going into breeding at 3 to 3.5, you don't need to do the condition score breeding, the pre-breeding one. That's why it's in italics, because if that's too often to do it in the year, we say the pre-breeding one is the one to drop. Then when you pregnancy scan, and our farmers all pretty much pregnancy scan between day 50 and 100 of pregnancy to work out if they're pregnant, the number of fetuses they have. Condition score then, because, and I'll talk about this later on, depending on how many fetuses she's got, the more demand she's got later on, and therefore a ewe with a higher condition or more fat is better able to cope. So you can make some informed decisions, and also around lambing as well, you can make some informed nutritional decisions, which I'll touch on. And just to show you, here's an example. A friend of mine, Tom Fraser, he did some research. So across the bottom is ME intake. And we've got 4 types of ewes. Those are the condition score 1, 2, 3, or 4. And you can see when they're being fed really well in lactation and getting 31 megajoules of energy, and our feed is about 12 megajoules, so it's about 2.5 kilograms of dry matter. If she's in poor condition versus good condition, there's very little difference in milk production. But when she's poorly fed and she's only getting 1.5 kilograms or 21 megajoules of energy per day, you can see that the thin ewes have no ability to buffer, no ability to draw on their own body reserves for milk production, and therefore milk production is impacted significantly. So we use those type of examples to say to farmers, that's why your pregnancy condition score, your condition score in pregnancy, to make sure you've got enough time to get condition on that ewe, so when she does lamb 70 or 80 days later, because you're pregnancy scanning in mid-pregnancy, she's of a higher body condition, because you never know how much feed you're going to get or have available in spring, and therefore you want her in good condition so you maximize milk production. And as I said, there's many, all the reproductive traits, there's similar graphs we can produce. And the other thing to remember, when you're in a constrained feed condition, a situation like we are in New Zealand, you have to choose which animals get the extra feed, because it's very difficult to bring feed in. But I'd say in your scenarios, if you bring extra feed in, it costs you extra money. So rather than feeding all the animals the same, to say, oh, I want to increase the condition score of all my ewes, half a condition, you can see at this graph, the highlighted squares are the extra energy required just for gaining half a condition score. So from going from a 2.5 to a 3 requires an extra 149 megajoules of energy. That's just for the gain part. But you can see to put a half a condition score on an animal that's 3.5 to make it a 4 costs you 351 megajoules of energy, while a ewe that's a condition score 2 and getting up to 2.5 only costs you 71 megajoules of energy. So if you're in a constrained feed situation, which one should you put that extra feed into? And then in your scenario, where feed costs you a lot of money, which one should you put it into? Well, you should put it into those lower condition score ewes, because A, it will cost you less feed and therefore less money to go up half a condition score. But if you go back to my slide 2 slides ago, remember that curvilinear relationship, you'll get a bigger jump in performance as a proportion by moving a 2 condition score ewe to 2.5 than you will moving a 3 condition score ewe to 3.5, but it's going to cost you 3 times as much food. So your gain in terms of performance will be less for the same amount of money. So we talk about targeted feeding in that respect. And we have these graphs for farmers, which would show, this graph is meant to show that here's a population, a distribution of ewes on your farm. The average is 2.5. You've got a percentage there in blue, which are 2.5 to 3, percentage above 3, which are in red, and half the ewes below 2.5. And you could feed them all together at the same to move up half a condition score. You could do that. You can put them all in the same paddock, a lot of feed, and say, I'm going to feed them all so they go up half a condition score. But there's no advantage because you've moved the 3s, which are already at optimum performance, to 3.5. No real jump in performance, but it costs you a lot of food. So we say to farmers, they're better to target their flock. That's that same graph there, and split the mob up, which you should be able to easily do in your pens indoors, and think about, for the food you've got and the cost, who should get the extra feed. And many of you probably do that anyway. And in this scenario, we're saying here, the ewes that are red, already above 3, you just hold them on a maintenance diet. Maybe even in this scenario, hold the blues at a maintenance diet because you haven't got much feed or you can't afford it, and just concentrate on that extra food in the group in the 3 so that they gain condition score. And so in time, you've got less ewes below that 2.5. And we call that targeted feeding. It's the most efficient way to feed animals from a cost perspective and return per kilo of feed. And that's what we say to our farmers. Think about the physiological stage of the ewe when you're making these decisions. Think about how much feed you got available. Have you got extra available? And how much of that extra is there? And therefore target who needs it best based on this graph here, so you can get your greatest return. A very simple but important graph from an economic perspective and a performance perspective. And so therefore we say to our farmers, their calendar year in terms of sheep performance starts at weaning. You wean all your ewes from their lambs, then you start working on body condition score, because now you've got a ewe that has no pregnancy demand, no lactation demand, and it's the easiest ewe to put body condition or fat onto. So we say, under our grazing scenario, split them into 2 mobs, those that are at that 3 or above, and hold them at maintenance. Because remember, we're talking about summer, autumn here, where pasture growth and quality is starting to decline, and those that at below 3, feed them above maintenance to gain condition. And we use a New Zealand term is we have them out in paddocks, and we say a truck and trailer approach. So the truck's at the front and the trailer is always attached behind a truck. So we say the thin ewes go in front, like the engine of a truck, and the fatty ewes, and they eat the grass down, take the best quality grass, their intake's not restricted, and then the fatty ewes, or better condition score ewes, come in behind as those ewes move to the next paddock and offer less feed. We call that a truck and trailer approach as we rotate around paddocks. And that'll allow you over 60 or 70 days, which is, you've got about 90 days in New Zealand from weaning through to rebreeding to gain that conditional score. Remember, if you're putting on 100 grams per day, when in one conditional score, most New Zealand breeds are somewhere between 6 and 8 kilos. Now, there are many things that affect ovulation rate. I just want to touch on those. But again, the focus of this talk, just like the ewe lambs, is I'm only going to focus on nutrition and body condition score because they're the biggest drivers. And I like to think about it like this. We could all own a Ferrari F1 race car. But if you put diesel in it, all you've got is a Ferrari F1 racing car that doesn't go anywhere. And sheep are the same. You can have the best genetics. You can have a very good animal health plan, etc. But if you don't feed them to their potential and have them good body condition score, they'll never reach their potential. So most of our advice to farmers is about nutrition and body condition score. And of course, if you're feeding them well and they're good body condition, they're less susceptible to some of the health problems we have in New Zealand. But clearly, we have a number of disease problems as well that we touch on and work with our farmers, but I won't be discussing today. So, just before breeding, it's the same thing. Some of you might have heard about the static effect or the impact on ovulation rate. It's what I talked about before, is the better the condition score of the animal, the higher the ovulation rate. And it plateaus at 3 and 3.5. So that means, because of the diminishing returns response, you don't need use of a greater condition score than that. And it's your very low condition score ones that end up bringing your flock average down. So that's why you want to minimize, always minimizing the tail. Targeted feeding, always minimizing the tail, because just how steep that drop-off is in performance. We use a term, and I'm not sure if you do, which is flushing or positive energy balance of the ewe going into breeding as a way of increasing ovulation rate. And that's a true effect. But again, if she's already of a body condition score 3 to 3.5, she actually has a very minimal to no response in some genotypes from extra feed just prior to breeding. So in other words, you don't get the flushing effect or the dynamic effect. So what that means is, on a per kilo of feed and therefore cost perspective, don't try to flush just before breeding a ewe that's already in very good body condition, because she will already be at her genetic potential from an ovulation rate perspective. And all you're doing is throwing more feed at her and not getting any response. You're better to put that extra food you're going to give to her into those thinner ewes, those poorer condition score ewes, get the flushing response, but also get them gaining condition. And that's a targeted use of feed. And under our situation, and again, I just a second on this, we have feeding guidelines well set up for our farmers. Ewes are now pregnant, and we get into mid-pregnancy. And for our farmers, we talk a lot to them about making sure they get their ewes pregnancy scanned. And I don't know this scenario in Canada, whether that's possible, but for our sheep, well over 90% get pregnancy scanned to determine if they're pregnant or not, and number of fetuses they're carrying, 1, 2, or 3. And if they get, and increasingly, it's been shown to be worthwhile in our scenario, remembering our farms have an average over 2,500 sheep, to know which ewes are going to lamb early versus those that are going to lamb later in spring, so we can start targeting feed in late pregnancy for those that need it most. And in our scenario, and it may be the same in yours when you're individually feeding, worthwhile. And some nice work that's been done in Australia to show that if you follow the feeding guidelines based on body condition score and a number of fetuses carried, your economic return from pregnancy scanning is higher as you go up the lambing percentages. So up from 1.25 ewes or 125% scanning, so 1.25 lambs per ewe, sorry, or 125% scanning, through to 1.5 lambs carried per ewe on average, or 150% scanning. The return is greater at higher lambing percentages, because if you're following the feeding guidelines, because there's more fetuses on board, if you follow the feeding guidelines, you will maximize their chance of survival, you will maximize her milk production, therefore you will maximize, hopefully, the weaning weight of those lambs. So your dollars, return per dollar spent, is greater in multiples than it is in singletons. And then what we say to our farmers is, once you know whether she's early or late lambing, once you know whether she's carrying 1, 2, or 3 lambs, and you've body condition scored her again at pregnancy scanning, you can then make informed decisions on who needs the feed the most and when. So from an economic point of view, you can target those ewes that need the most, and therefore where you'll get your biggest return per kilo of food or dollar you spend. And under our outdoors lambing situations, we would say that the hierarchy of demand is those that need the most are your poor condition, multiple bearing ewes, those carrying twins and triplets, lambing first. And those that need the least ewes that are only carrying singles, that are later lambing. And depending on how many groups the farmer is happy to manage around his paddocks, they will divide them up somewhere between 3 to 5 mobs, as I've got there. targeting when you've got a capped feed supply, who needs it the most, therefore where you'll get your greater return. Because we know that a single bearing ewe only carrying one fetus she's more able to buffer if things get bad, because she's only got that one demand from a fetus growing and only suckling one lamb in lactation. Our later lambing ewes in New Zealand won't be lambing too well into spring, so we'll be growing lots of feed so they can cope. And as I said, the farmers then make decisions on how many mobs they are happy to manage. And then based on that, we know that under pasture feeding and late pregnancy, the ewes, even with pasture feeding, optimal pasture feeding, will still struggle to eat enough feed to meet their theoretical pregnancy requirements. You know, in the very last few days of pregnancy, each fetus is growing 100 to 150 grams per day. The fluids is gaining by that much. So it's a lot of total feed that's needed, and they struggle under pasture. So we know that our ewes lose condition as they buffer through late pregnancy and through the lactation. So that red line is our optimal body condition score target over the 12-month cycle for our twin bearing ewes or triplet bearing ewes, and the blue one is our single bearing optimum profile. So that's what all I wanted to say about ewe wastage. Mature ewe management. Does anyone have any questions?
Merci, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. I don't know on the English side. I think that there was a question. Jad, was that the case?
Yeah, we do have a question, although I was not sure if I understood correctly, but there was a question about heating stress. Does it affect lamb and ewes? So I asked for clarifications. I didn't have any yet.
Did you say heat stress or distress?
Heating stress.
Heat stress.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah. So heat stress will reduce appetite because all of us, when we're cold, which is some of the reason why we put on weight in the winter, is digestion itself increases body heat. So if you're too hot in the summer, you actually want to eat less. And the same is for sheep. So heat stress can have two impacts. It can change the physiology of the animal. And in addition to that, they'll want to eat less. And so both of those, therefore, can affect you live weight, body condition score, your performance, and therefore that of your offspring.
Thank you very much.
Moi, j'aurais peut-être une question.
I have a question. I don't know if we have a lot of time, but for New Zealand, Paul, what is the cost for feeding? Here in Quebec, to give you an example, we're looking at more than 45% of the cost is feed cost in sheep production. What is the case? It seemed to us that it's not as costly for you because the animals are grazing outside for the most part, but you seem to be emphasizing this point a great deal by dividing up the groups based on condition scores. So it does seem to be an important portion in your country as well.
Yeah, feed is the biggest cost in New Zealand because for us, yes, it grows naturally, the pasture, but you've got to have more land, so land comes at a cost, or you're continually renewing it, maybe 5 to 10% of your farm every year in pasture. So pasture is the biggest cost, and on top of that, we don't grow the same amount of pasture for every month of the year. So we grow a lot less in the winter through that May, June, July period, when the ewe needs more because she's going into late pregnancy. And so the targeted feeding is about feed costs are high if you incorporate the value of the land and the value of recropping and replanting, but also you have to target the feed you have, which is going to be less during that period. So that's why we also target it so much, because we're growing less when we need more.
D'accord, merci.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. I'll let you continue.
Okay, I'll just quickly touch on ewe wastage before we get on to breeding out of season, because I'm talking too slowly. For us in New Zealand, one of the big issues now we're driving towards is we're getting, as I alluded in the earlier graphs, high lambing percentage, greater lactational performance, heavier lamb weaning weights, more lambs wean, and that's putting more pressure on the ewes. And when you're just, as I said, you have a set feed supply. And so we're really worried about longevity, making sure our ewes get to that 6 years of age, because if they don't, they cost you more money because you need more replacements. So for us, wastage is ewes that don't meet that 6 years of age. They're either prematurely culled because they fail to get pregnant, or fail to successfully wean a lamb, or they've got ill health, or they die on the farm. It doesn't include those ewes that get to that 6 years of age. And we've done some economic analysis, and because which shows that high ewe wastage, your income is less. And if you can reduce ewe wastage on an average North Island hill country farm, which is one of those 8 classes of farms, for every 1% increase in ewe wastage, your income goes down about $1,000. So it's a big impact. And one of the reasons what people forget about is if you have higher ewe wastage, so ewes that don't last in the flock, it means you need more younger ewes. And younger ewes, as you all know, have lower reproductive and lower lactational performance. So the average age of your flock declines, your average reproductive performance and lactational performance of your flock decline, which then means the average weight of lamb weaned per year declines. And of course, by having also more younger ewes, you have to have more replacements come in. So therefore you have less lambs to sell as well. So it has an additional impact on your financial return. So for us, we've done a lot of work across the country, ourselves and other groups, looking at when's the greatest period of loss. And for us, outdoor situation, most of our losses are occurring, not surprisingly, when the ewe's under a greatest physiological strain, which is in late pregnancy, so mid to late pregnancy and lactation. And so that's a focus of intervention and monitoring, and again, back to that targeted feeding. I talked about, we worry about it so much because if the ewes don't meet those targets, they're more likely to die as well. So that's another reason why we talk about that so much. And of course, if a ewe dies in that late pregnancy period or in lactation, that contributes to lamb losses. So you have less lambs to sell as well. And this is across tens and tens of thousands of sheep. We've done a lot of monitoring on farms, on commercial farms. And we've looked at the body condition score and how important it is in terms of the ewe being there the next year. So we have animals called two-tooths, which are the animals have their first two permanent incisors. They're 18 months to 2 years of age in our situation. Their chance of being culled or sold early before they get to 6 years of age is 57% lower per unit increase in body condition score at that 18 to 2 years of age. In other words, the better the body condition score they are at that age, the more likely they are to not be culled. And again, even looking at deaths, the better the condition score they are, the less likely they are to die in the next 12 months and in the next 3 to 4 years. And again, even if you do it in a 4-year-old ewe, you get those same general relationships. So that's why, you know, I've talked so much today about body condition score and nutrition. Yes, it's important from a fertility fecundity perspective, but it also in New Zealand is the underpinning reason, if you don't get that right, for ewes not lasting to 6 years of age and therefore lower flock performance by having greater ewe wastage. So that's all I wanted to say on that. Is there any quick questions before we move to out of season breeding?
Not on my side, thanks.
No, okay. We'll go into out of season breeding. So that's not a big issue in New Zealand because remember, we're once a year lambing. However, our farmers remember we're Southern Hemisphere, so the further north they are, so closer to the equator, and on the east side of New Zealand, the drier it is, and the warmer the winter, and therefore the drier the summer. So they, instead of being lambing in late August through to October, some of them might be lambing in early July through to early August. And therefore they do manipulate the breeding season slightly as a way of avoiding the summer dry and trying to get lambs born earlier before everyone else in the world, in New Zealand, so they can sell their lambs earlier before there's a lot of lambs on the market and get a higher price. It can also be used, as it is in Canada, to lamb 3 times in 2 years. And for about 6 years here at the university, we had a flock doing the star system for about 6 years as a demonstration, which I'll touch on. But in New Zealand, there's about 12,000 flocks, and I would say less than 50 of those are lambing more than once a year. So it is, if out-of-season breeding is being used in New Zealand, it's really solely being used to move the breeding date forward 1 to 2 months. And as I said, this is the star system that we used. It's based on the Cornell star system. We just pretty much copied it, just changed it to meet the New Zealand seasonal environments. We were breeding 5 times in a year. We split our flock up into 3 groups, and every 70 or so days we were breeding some ewes. So we had 5 lots of 70 days in a year breeding dates. So each year ewe was lambing 3 times in 2 years. We, because the Romney breed is very seasonal, we used a crossbred, a Romney East Friesian. East Friesian in New Zealand is less seasonal. It is still quite seasonal, but less seasonal. It'll breed for about an extra 2 months of the year than the Romney will, but it produces far more milk. And in this scenario, when we were weaning at 70 days, because we were rebreeding after 70 days, so you would lamb and 70 days later we would rebreed her, that extra milk production we figured was important so we can maximize the weaning weights. So I have some experience with breeding all year round. So to get a ewe to breed all year round, you have to manipulate the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And the breeding season is detected by the animal, and there are 2 principal factors which cause the onset of breeding activity. There's a photoperiod change. More hours of darkness is detected by the optic nerve, which sends a signal to the hypothalamus, and the reproductive activity can start. And the optic nerve also stimulates the pineal gland as well to produce melatonin, which also has an impact on the reproductive system, inducing performance in the ewe. Now, there's lots of things that affect breeding season. We don't have time to cover all of those. I'm just going to touch on a few. Nutrition cannot be used as a way of inducing breeding significantly outside the breeding season. But very poor condition can inhibit estrus activity in females that are induced to cycle. So rather than having a positive effect, nutrition here, making sure she's well fed in good condition, is about ensuring if you do use hormones to induce her to cycle, that she will respond. Stress can delay the onset, and we know that younger animals are less likely to respond. There's breed variation, and I'm not sure which breeds you have, but I just picked on some breeds that we might have in New Zealand. We know that the Merino, because it was from North Africa, has close to the equator, is less seasonal. So in New Zealand, it'll start cycling in late December, January, when our Romneys won't really be starting till March. And then we have other breeds that have a longer season as well. We don't have Ramulay, Romanov, but other parts of the world do, and you might have a greater breeding season. And we also know, as you know, that some of the hair sheep are less seasonal. And in New Zealand, some of the hair breeds are starting to come into New Zealand as farmers are moving away from that wool production. In New Zealand, of course, we have the most seasonal breeds in the world, which are your British long wool breeds, the Romney, etc. So you can choose breed. You can select within breed. You can get slow to limited progress, low heritability. Selection is typically based in most situations looking at females that naturally onset breeding activity outside the normal breeding season. But you can also look at the male as well. You can look at the size of the testes, change in the size of the testes, the colour of the testes as subjective indicators that he's coming into breeding season, and select the males based on that. You can use the male effect. So like we talked about that with the ewe lambs, the sudden introduction of the male just before the natural onset of the breeding season, 3 to 4 weeks prior to the normal breeding season. Under New Zealand situations, you can induce earlier starting. So if you want those dry environments in New Zealand and you want to be breeding in late January, February, rather than March, April, some farmers might use the teaser. And just like in the ewe lamb, it's his pheromones that are effective. In Australia, they also use cycling ewes of some breeds to induce other ewes to cycle. It's called social facilitation. It's not so successful, but it can be used. And this is the point I was making before, whether it's puberty onset or breeding season onset. If you introduce the ram on, say, on day 0, within 48 hours, the ewes will respond, those that are going to respond. And they'll have a silent ovulation, so they'll ovulate, but they won't show heat or estrus. In other words, a ram wouldn't know that ovulated, because that's within any breeding season or within any breeding animal, the first ovulation a female has will always be like this. And then what happens is half of them or so will then have a silent estrus and will then go on and have an overt estrus that the ram can detect 17 days later and breed. The other half will actually, that first ovulation, that first ova or egg, won't actually last the whole 17 days and it'll die. And then she'll have another silent ovulation and a proper one there. So that's kind of, you know, if you had 100 ewes and they were all at the optimal time, 3 to 4 weeks before the natural onset of breeding, and you put the teaser, and that's the type of relationship you would get in terms of percentage of ewes, those two groupings, that would be cycling, that you better breed on any given day post that. So that's the natural response to induced cycling activity, whether it's induced puberty or breeding out of season by using a teaser. And in New Zealand, what some of our farmers do actually is also use the teaser, but don't, which is the top graph here, because they want to breed in April, but they use the teaser to start the ewe cycling earlier, which is the bottom graph, say in late January, early February, so that when she's at her 3rd ovulation for the season, 3rd to 4th ovulation is the peak ovulation within a ewe's breeding season. That's occurring when breeding is occurring. So you get a slightly higher ovulation rate of, say, maybe 0.2 or 0.2 extra eggs. So some of our farmers do that as well as a way of increasing ovulation rate. So using the teaser to get her cycling, but not breeding her early, but when the normal breeding period comes along, she's in her 3rd or 4th ovulation for that season and higher ovulation rate. The entire intact male is the best for that. Less seasonal breeds are more effective, i.e. a Romney ram's not great at it. In New Zealand scenario, people will use Poll Dorsets or Merino rams because they're less seasonal. You can, so in Australia, you'll often see hormone-treated wethers or ewes. You can buy actually the androgens that you can pour on the back of a ewe or a wether, and that smell can induce that response without having entire rams or intact rams running around. You can use vasectomized males, and there are some studies to show that the smell of a buck or a male goat can work with ewes as well. So that work, but the best is the entire ram. A couple of other quick points there. The female needs to be isolated. So if the rams are within a few, close to those ewes all the time, well, the ram effect won't work because they're always smelling them. They can smell them a few hundred meters away. And males are more smelly if they're kept cycling all year round. So in our scenario, when we did the star system, we had no problems because those rams were breeding every 70 days. So they were always working in our situation. So they were nice and smelly and worked as we hoped. The other way to do it is to use exogenous hormones or artificial hormones and to bypass the fact that the ewe's not naturally cycling. And there's 3 main regimes. There's just before the breeding season, you can use progesterone alone. And what you're trying to do there is sensitize the brain to the effects of progesterone. So if I go back to this graph here, you're stopping that first ovulation from being silent because she's already had prior exposure to high levels of progesterone. So she'll have a normal overt estrus. So what you're trying to do in those first 3 to 7 days, rather than have a silent estrus, like she has here, you're having an overt estrus. So that's what the progesterone priming does. And so that can work. And if it's used, as I said, just prior to the normal onset of mating, if she fails to get pregnant, you're now getting closer and closer to the normal onset of season, and she'll continue to cycle. If you're well outside the breeding period, you're going to have to use progesterone, so that first ovulation is not silent, and something like ECG or equine chronic gonadotropin, sorry, or ECG. Used to be called PMSG as well, and in some countries it's still called PMSG. It's an injection which has similar activities to follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. You generally put the cedar in or the progesterone in for a period of time, and then depending on the regime you're using, you'd be giving some ECG 1 or 2 days, or sometimes the day of that cedar removal. And everyone has their own regime. If you talk to different veterinarians or different reproductive consultants, their recipe, which I like to call a recipe, will always slightly differ because they believe that their recipe works best for them. So that's the general program. Is a period of progesterone, then the ECG, but the period of that progesterone and the amount of ECG given and when it is given differs based on different consultants or veterinarians, and based on the different scenario, how far you are out for the natural breeding season, and also the breed. The last way, or the last type of hormonal regime you can use is melatonin. You can put an implant, melatonin implant in, so you get the animal gets elevated levels of melatonin, which mimics what happens naturally when you've got increased hours of darkness. So in the winter, or as days get shorter, which is what naturally triggers use to start cycling, the animal has increased levels of melatonin in their system, which triggers the reproductive performance. So if you give it exogenous or artificial melatonin, you can have that response as well. And so generally, most regimes, you put a little implant under the skin of the ear for about a month prior to the joining of the ram, and it can be effective. It's most effective closer to the start of the breeding season, but it can be effective. And also some people use it in their rams to keep them working as well. Okay, I ran out of time and talked too much. Sorry about that, and probably went a bit quick at the end. Is there any questions?
Vous êtes bien repris, Paul.
You caught up really quickly there, Paul, so it's not an issue. I think that Jad had a question.
Yeah, so I do have a question about your photo period protocol. So how do you manage the outdoors lights? Do you use closed barns or?
So we don't. So in New Zealand, as I said, probably less than 50 of our 1,200 flocks are breeding well out of season. And in all of those situations, they're not worrying about the photo period. They're using progesterone plus ECG, which overrides the photo period response. Okay. Or if they're going to breed slightly before the start of the season, so in late summer, before the days start to get shorter, the ram effect or the male effect is just enough to get them cycling. So again, they don't worry about the photo period.
Thank you.
Merci. Donc, je ne
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. So I think that will end our webinar. Just before we end, I put the link to answer our brief survey if you would like to do that. So I'll invite all of the participants to click on that link. I want to really thank Paul for being with us tonight. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think that with all of the questions that you received and the participation, we had up to 60 participants at one point. I see that some are leaving, but we had a great participation rate. So this seems to be a topic that our farmers were really interested in. So I want to thank all of the participants for being with us tonight as well. And in our newsletter, we'll have some information, and you'll find the recording for the presentation as well as Paul's PDF slide presentation for anyone who wants to have access to that. So now, thank you, and I look forward to the next webinar. Enjoy your evening. And we'll keep Paul with us just for a few minutes, if you don't mind staying on, Paul, with
that's
Jade
no problem,
and I.
man. That's no problem. And if anyone wants to email me, because now you know where I work, it's on the first slide, because you don't feel comfortable to ask questions, you could look me up and I'll be happy to ask any questions.
Parfait.
That's great. I'm just keeping an eye out to see if there are others. I get a lot of comments, a lot of thank yous. Very interesting. Thank you, Mr. Kenyon. That was really interesting. Thanks to you. And I have one person saying, I have a question, Paul Cardin. Maybe you could put that question in the Q&A. What about you, Jade? Is there one last question? And those who want to leave, you can do so.
I see one in the French, sorry, in the English section. Is the 135% production, is it lambing, stats, or to market?
That's to weaning. That's to weaning, and we only get about 1 to 2% loss after that post weaning through the market. But there are farmers, as I showed in that distribution graph, that are achieving 150 or 1.5, 100, 1.7. So we're moving more towards that slowly, the higher percentages.
Okay, thank you. I also had another question. I believe we've answered it a little in the beginning, though. I had a question here. Do you believe that there's a big difference between breeding at 12 months old versus 8 months old, money-wise?
From 12 months of age, you'll get higher performance and she'll be a bit more mature. So there's that advantage. But in our scenario, if you bred her at 12 months of age, she wouldn't have enough time to get pregnant, to lactate, and to wean her lamb, and to get back in to be at the same breeding date as the mature ewes, because remember, they already are bred a month later. So 8 months for us is optimal, so that when she's 18 months, she's now back with the rest of the mature flock at the same time from a management perspective, because we're outdoors under those extensive conditions. So indoors would be different. You're probably okay.
Thank you.
Merci. Je ne vois pas d'autres questions.
Thank you. We have Mr. Cardin's question. I'll let you ask it, Jade. It's in English.
Est-ce que tu m'entends, Jade?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Jade?
The question has already been answered.
Ah, de Paul Cardin?
Paul Cardin's question?
Oh, no, sorry. I don't have this one on my side either. Oh, in English, I can see it.
OK.
Oh. Okay,
écoute,
okay.
je peux je vais te l'envoyer parce que...
Yeah,
I'll send it to you.
You don't seem to push for high prolificity through either other breeds or management. Here we say that the first lamb pays the bill and the second is a profit.
That's right. So I think I'm answering the question correctly. So if you're going to make money out of breeding new lambs, you have to at least get the lamb, or 80% of those lambs alive to weaning. So that makes where the money is. If you can't do that, we say to our farmers, don't bother breeding new lambs. And that was that economic analysis that we did. But also for mature ewes, now we know that in different analysis and farm working we're doing, it's better for farmers to increase their mature reproductive performance up to 1.5 to 1.6. Once they get past that, because they're ending up with more triplets, which aren't great under outdoor scenarios, they're then better to focus on increasing weaning weights as a way of making more money. So it depends where you are on that reproductive spectrum.
Thank you very much.
Parfait. J'ai une autre petite
And
question.
there's another brief question, and maybe we can end on that one. At what age is the lamb slaughtered for meat?
So in New Zealand, the average lamb is slaughtered at 5 months of age, but some are slaughtered at 3 months and some are slaughtered at 11 months. But when you look at the slaughter data from our abattoirs, the average kill date is in the last week of February, which puts them about 5.5 months of age. It's the midpoint of slaughter. And our carcass weights are 19 kilos. So they're lighter than Australian carcasses.
OK, parfait.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I think that that covers it. We're still getting some great comments to thank you, Paul, for this great presentation. It was really interesting. So these are all great comments. And maybe we can stop the recording here, Jade.